Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Message Compliance and Archiving with Microsoft Lync Server 2013. In this video presentation, you're going to be introduced to the archiving features of Microsoft Lync Server 2013. If you work in an industry where you're subject to compliance, and we hear this all the time, SOX compliance, HIPAA requirements, well, Microsoft Lync Server does allow us to capture certain types of communication for compliance purposes. With the archiving feature of Lync Server 2013, the product provides a mechanism that allows us to capture instant messaging content, whether it's peer-to-peer or multi-party IM. We also can capture web conferencing or meeting content, and we have the ability to retain information either in a backend SQL Server database, like we did with Lync Server 2010, but we now have the ability to archive over to Microsoft Exchange Server 2013. In this video presentation, you're going to be introduced to the features of archiving. You'll also see how to set up the archiving, both with SQL Server and also with Microsoft Exchange. And then we're going to wrap up the presentation with a demonstration on setting up and using archiving. So let's get started. The archiving feature of Lync Server 2013 allows a Microsoft Lync administrator in the organization to capture certain types of information, for example, instant messaging, and also web-based collaboration, for example, file uploads in a conference, or we can gather information regarding when people are joining or leaving our conferences. When we set up the archiving with Lync 2013, you have a couple of choices. We can archive over to a backend SQL Server database, and in this case, we have to define this inside of our topology builder. To define a database for archiving with SQL Server, it's a similar process to what we had with Lync Server 2010. So you would have to go into your topology builder, and this can be done during the initial topology design. It can also be done after the fact. You add your databases to your topology, and then you would have to publish your topology once again. Keep in mind that this does require a full working version of SQL Server. If in the organization we have users that are homed on a Microsoft Exchange Server 2013 environment, and they have their mailboxes put on what's called in-place hold, if we meet all of these requirements, we can enable Microsoft Exchange integration with Lync Server, and we can archive our data over on the Exchange Server 2013 environment. So the archiving gets stored inside of your Microsoft Exchange databases. As we go through the process of defining the archiving, we have the ability to define what we want to archive, whether it's internal communication, external communication, or both. Archiving by default is not enabled. We then also specify who we want to archive. Is it a global setting? Do we want to archive at the site level, or maybe right down to the individual user level? You want to keep in mind that archiving will get enforced right down to the user level. So if I have a user that's in a conference, and that one user has archiving enabled but the other users don't, the conference is going to get archived. Once you've enabled archiving with Lync 2013, you'll have the ability to capture peer-to-peer instant messaging, as well as conferencing content, which includes multi-party IM, file uploads in a conference, which we typically call handouts. We can also capture event-related activities, for example, a user joining or leaving a conference, uploading content or sharing content, and also changes in visibility. A brand new feature that we have with Lync Server 2013 that we didn't have with 2010 is the ability to capture whiteboards and polls shared during a conference. This brings us over to our next topic: what type of content is not archived with the Lync Server 2013 archiving? Peer-to-peer file transfers. Now keep in mind that doesn't include the file handouts in a conference. Files that get uploaded into a conference, those can get archived. Peer-to-peer file transfers are not. The archiving also does not have the ability to capture the audio or the video for a conference, desktop sharing, or application sharing. The archiving is not recording your meeting, it's only capturing your instant messaging content and some of your conferencing content, such as your file handouts. Another very important point is that your Lync Server does not archive your persistent chat conversations. You would have to enable the persistent chat compliance service to capture that information. One of the big architectural changes that we have with Lync Server 2013 is that archiving is now automatically installed on your front-end servers. So it's co-located on your front-end servers. We don't use dedicated servers for this anymore. It's part of an effort from Microsoft to consolidate your servers or to minimize the number of servers required within your environment. Now, that doesn't mean that the archiving is enabled and configured. We still have to do that. And the process that you go through is going to vary depending upon whether you're using a SQL Server on the back end for your data storage, or if you're going to use the Microsoft Exchange integration. To use the Microsoft Exchange integration, it does require Microsoft Exchange Server 2013 exclusively. So a user's mailbox has to reside on Exchange Server 2013, and their mailboxes also have to be put on in-place hold. In order to configure the settings for these clients, you would use your Microsoft Exchange 2013 policies and configuration settings to control the archiving of the Lync Server 2013 data for those individuals. As an alternative to archiving over to a Microsoft Exchange Server environment, we still have the ability to archive over to a back-end SQL Server database. This is using the same technique that we used back with Lync Server 2010, where we stored our instant messaging content over inside of an LCS log database, over on a SQL Server. At Carve Rock Fitness, we have Microsoft Exchange Server 2013, so that's not going to be an issue for us. But we may have some users that don't have their mailboxes on place hold, and the design team may just not want to deploy the integration with Microsoft Exchange. If you're archiving over on a SQL Server, you don't have to worry about the configuration settings over on the Exchange Server side, like you would have to use if you had integration with Exchange for your archiving. Before deploying your Lync Server 2013 archiving, you should be extremely familiar with the infrastructure, the archiving, and the data storage prerequisites and requirements that will support the archiving within the environment. Let's take a look at our prerequisites. As we look at the prerequisites for setting up archiving, an important point to note is that Microsoft's message queuing is not required as a feature on your front-end servers and your archiving servers anymore to support this. With the Microsoft Lync Server 2010 product, if you deployed archiving, you had agents that ran on your front-end servers, and they would capture the data, and they would transfer the data over to your archiving server through Microsoft message queuing. Well, the archiving is now co-located on the front-end servers, so we don't have to use the message queuing to support this. With the prior version of Lync Server, Lync 2010, when you went out and you set up your archiving and you defined it inside of your topology builder, you would have to define a back-end SQL server to maintain your LCS log database, and you also had to define a file share on the network, and that was used to maintain your handouts, so when you uploaded content into a meeting, it got maintained in a file share. Well, now that we have the archiving co-located on the front-end servers, the archiving uses the Lync Server 2013 file storage for temporary storage of your meeting content files. That's the same exact file share that you defined when you created your topology and you defined your pool. So you don't have to set up a separate file store for archiving. Since Microsoft has now co-located the archiving functionality right on your front-end servers, the archiving server is no longer a dedicated server role that you can deploy on your network. The unified data collection agents required for this now run on your front-end servers. We just have to configure this and deploy it properly. As an archiving prerequisite for Microsoft Exchange Server, you have to have Microsoft Exchange Server 2013 if you're going to maintain your archive content on the Exchange environment. If your Microsoft Exchange environment is running in a mixed environment where you still have some legacy Exchange servers, only mailboxes hosted on Exchange Server 2013 would be compliant or would be compatible. So if you had some mailboxes that were stored on a legacy Microsoft Exchange server, like for example 2007 or 2010, the archiving content for these users would have to be maintained on a back-end SQL Server database, not in the Exchange Server database. With the Microsoft Exchange storage integration, your meeting content files get archived as attachments inside of the Microsoft Exchange environment, and this content is accessible through Microsoft Exchange Discovery. You have to take into consideration the maximum storage size and make sure that it supports the storage of the meeting content files as well as your Microsoft Exchange mailbox content, like your typical mail or voicemails and things such as this. When we look at the archiving prerequisites for our SQL Server-based environment, we have to use a version of SQL Server that's compatible with Lync Server 2013 archiving. So for users who are not homed on Exchange Server 2013, or if we decide we don't want to use the integration option, our backend SQL Server has to be either SQL Server 2008 R2 or SQL Server 2012. And for each of them, it would be a 64-bit, either standard or enterprise edition. The SQL servers do not have to be dedicated SQL servers, so they can be handling other databases, such as, for example, maintaining your topology database. Keep in mind that the SQL Server 2008 R2 or SQL Server 2012 Express editions are not supported, and 32-bit versions of SQL Server are not supported either. It's got to be 64-bit. Let's take a look at some of the steps that are involved with the deployment process. The steps involved for the deployment process of archiving It's going to vary depending upon what we're using for our backend storage, whether it's Microsoft Exchange Server Mailbox database storage or Microsoft SQL Server storage over on the Lync Server side. If we're maintaining our data storage over on the Microsoft Exchange Server environment, we have to configure Exchange Server in-place hold policies to maintain and support the archiving for the users that are homed over on the Exchange 2013 environment. For archiving that's going to be maintained in a SQL Server-based environment, we have to define our SQL Server databases inside of our topology by using the topology builder, and we have to publish that back into CMS. Before you can deploy Microsoft Lync Server 2013 archiving, we have to make sure that we have all of the necessary prerequisite hardware and software in place. Since we now do not have a dedicated archiving server role, for your front-end servers, well, we just have to make sure that we have our Microsoft Lync Server 2013 prerequisites. So you got to have a 2013 server up and running. So in our case, we're going to be using front-end servers. If you're using Microsoft Exchange integration, you have to have Microsoft Exchange Server 2013, and you want to make sure that you have enough data storage to maintain your mailbox content and your storage content for the archiving. If you're maintaining the archiving content in SQL Server, well, then you have to have Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2 or 2012 Standard or Enterprise editions, and those would have to be 64-bit. When using a Microsoft SQL Server for the archiving storage database, you have to define your databases inside of the topology builder and then publish your topology back into the central management store. As you're setting up the integration between Microsoft Exchange Server 2013 and Lync Server 2013, you have to configure the authentication between the two products. And this is done by configuring Exchange Server 2013 to be a partner application for the Lync Server 2013 product. After you have set up each of these products to be partner applications to each other, you would then typically test the Exchange storage connectivity, and we have a commandlet for this testing. It's test-cs-ex storage connectivity. When we're configuring the archiving policies, if we're using Microsoft Exchange integration, we have to configure our policies through the Microsoft Exchange in-place hold policies. When archiving over to the Microsoft SQL Server-based environment, well, then we have to define our policies on the Lync Server side. We have to define our archiving options such as whether we're going to use critical mode, which means we'll shut down functionality if we're not able to archive certain types of content. We'll also define settings for maintaining the data inside of our database. For example, how long can that content be maintained in the database before it's automatically purged out? Let's take a high-level look at configuring archiving policies. When we configure the archiving policies for Lync Server 2013, the techniques that we employ will vary depending upon whether we're configuring the archiving for integration with Exchange Server 2013 or if we're going to archive over to SQL Server. When you configure the archiving policies, you'll have to define the scope of your policies. And as you're going to see in the demonstration, we can define our policies globally, at the site level, and even right down to the user level. And you have to keep in mind that the policy will get enforced right down to the user level. As we configure the archiving policies, you're going to see some settings where you can determine whether we're going to archive internal communication, external communication, or possibly both. As we define the archiving policies, whether through Microsoft Exchange or through Microsoft Lync Server, we have to consider the archiving storage, the amount of space that we're going to allocate for storage, and how long we're going to maintain the content up inside of our databases. If we're archiving content over on the Exchange Server mailbox databases, we have to account for the extra storage for the mailboxes. But we do have the added value of being able to perform discovery on the Microsoft Exchange Server side with the Microsoft Exchange toolsets. If we're maintaining the information on a backend SQL Server with our Lync Server 2013 policies, we can define how long that database content gets maintained before it's automatically purged out of the system. If archiving of content is critical to your organization, Microsoft has a feature called Critical Mode that we can enable inside of our policies. If you have enabled Critical Mode on your policies, if conferencing content or instant messaging content cannot be archived, the Lync Server will block the ability to use certain functionality of the product. It shuts stuff down. So as an example of this, if you have a web conferencing user uploading a file, but the system doesn't have the ability to upload the file into the archiving file store, your conferences will get switched over to a restricted mode, and you won't be able to use this feature. Another example is if the archiving service is unable to send a message to your Lync storage service, the instant messaging functionality can be blocked completely until the archiving support is re-enabled or restored within your environment. Next, we're going to take a look at the archive storage support provided with Lync Server 2013. Before we deploy the Microsoft Lync Server archiving, one of the things that we have to consider is the archive storage. We can either store the archiving content on Microsoft Exchange if we've integrated with Microsoft Exchange Server 2013. We can also store content on a backend SQL Server database. Once we enable archiving at Carverock Fitness, we're going to be using up roughly about 60 kbps per day per user. Now, whether we store the information on SQL or on Microsoft Exchange Server, we're still going to have to account for a lot of data storage, so we're going to have to work this into our design. Now, the 60 kbps per day per user, that's a number that Microsoft likes to throw around. It's a rough estimate. You got to remember that that can vary depending upon the type of organization and the type of activity that goes on within your organization. You may get more accurate numbers by setting up a small pilot within your organization before you push the product out to the masses. When you're storing your archive content on a SQL Server database, if you don't want to store your archive content for an extended period of time, Microsoft provides a tool that they call the Session Export tool. The Session Export tool is actually a commandlet, export-cs archiving data. If you run this tool up against your database, you have to define a start date and an end date for the archival. So you're basically telling the product that I want to archive content from this point in time to that point in time to an output folder. And what the product's going to do is it's going to take the sessions within that time frame and it's going to generate EML files in the folder that you've defined, the output folder. When you look inside of the EML files, you should find the instant messaging or conference transcripts. You'll also find any conference activity, including files that have been uploaded into a meeting as handouts. They're included as attachments. The Session Export tool also marks the data as being exported and safe to delete, kind of like a backup program. Now for the fun part. Let's take a look at a demonstration on configuring archiving with Lync Server 2013. I've just switched over to my Microsoft Lync Server, and we're going to take a look at a demonstration on setting up the archiving. So the first thing that we're going to do in this demonstration is open up our Lync Server topology builder, and we'll take a look at setting up integration with a Microsoft SQL Server backend for archiving. So as I connect into my topology, I'm going to download my topology from the existing deployment, and my system is going to prompt me for the name of a file that I'm going to work off of, my local XML file. So we'll give that a couple of seconds, and there we go. We'll give our file a name, and I'll call mine archiving, and we're going to save that as a topology builder XML file, tbxml. Here you can see that I have my Lync Server directory structure. I've got my two sites, Scottsdale and Phoenix. So the process that I would go through is I would navigate down here to my Lync Server 2013. Here you can see that I have my Enterprise Edition front-end pool. I'm going to right-click on my pool and go to Edit Properties. Then we're going to scroll down just a little bit. And here's where you can see that I can configure archiving to use a backend SQL Server store. So in this case here, if you want to use Microsoft SQL Server, as opposed to using Microsoft Exchange Server 2013 as your data store, well, this is where you would define that. Here you can see that archiving is going to be enabled. I'll specify my archiving SQL Server store. I'm going to use the same server, my SQL 1 box. The same server that I'm using for my topology for CMS. Down below you also have the option to enable SQL Server Store mirroring, which again is a new enhancement that we have with Microsoft Lync Server 2013. With the prior version of Lync 2010, we had the ability to use clustering, but now clustering is not supported. We're now using SQL Server Store mirroring to provide that higher level of availability. So here I'm going to click on OK. I'm then going to right-click on my topology, then go down to the option to publish my topology. I want to push those changes back into the central management store, back into CMS. On the next property sheet, I have my published topology Create Databases property window, and it reads the following dedicated databases are part of your topology. Some of the databases listed below have not been created. If you have the appropriate permissions on the SQL Server, you can create the databases when you publish your topology. So here, because I'm logged on with elevated credentials, I'm going to be able to create my database on the back end on the fly. I should end up with an LCS log database, an MDF database file on SQL. Let's click on Next. And as you can see, I was able to publish my topology successfully. So here we're going to click on Finish, and then close out of my topology builder. The next thing that we're going to do is take a look at our control panel, and we'll look at some of the archive configuration settings that we have available to us. So here we're going to launch the Lync Server control panel. Next, we'll provide our credentials. From inside of the control panel, we want to configure the archiving, which is listed here underneath Monitoring and Archiving. You can see that I have a couple of tabs, one for the archiving policy and another for the archiving configuration. Underneath the archiving policy, you can see that I have a global policy that gets created when you enable archiving. Well, in this case here, you'll notice that I also have a site policy. So you can go in and you can define policies at the site level. So if I want to apply a specific policy to Scottsdale or to Phoenix, I can also apply policies right down to the individual user level. So in this case, you could create a user or what we call a tag level policy, but then you would have to apply it to the users. When I open up my policy, you can see that I have my archiving for internal communication. So in my case, I want to enable archiving for both internal and for external. Now, if you only needed external archiving, well, there you go. I'm going to select both of these for Kavrak Fitness. We'll click on Commit. Let's take a look at the archiving configuration. Once again, when you go to configure the archiving configuration settings, you can apply the policy here globally, or at the site, or right down to the pool level. And if you look at the properties for this, you'll notice that the default is that archiving is disabled. And if I opt to, I can choose here if I want to enable archiving for instant messaging. I can also enable it for IM and the web conferencing sessions. So here you can see that Microsoft with the Lync Server product, they've consolidated the settings all together, as opposed to what we had back with the Office Communications Server environment. Underneath this, you have an option that reads Block Instant Messaging or Web Conferencing Sessions if archiving fails. This is the feature that we referred to as critical mode in the video, where if the Microsoft Lync Server isn't able to archive content, it can shut down certain functionality of Lync for your clients. Here's the new feature that we have with Lync Server 2013, the ability to enable Exchange Server integration. With Lync Server 2010, the interface looked very similar, but you didn't have this option here. At the bottom of the console, you have the option to enable purging of archiving data. You'll notice that I can purge exported archiving data and stored archiving data that's older than so many days. So if I use the export-cs archiving data commandlet, what we call the session export tool, it marks the data as being exported so that the product knows that it's safe to purge out that content. Well, here you can see that I can also define the maximum number of days that I want to maintain that content up on my SQL Server database. The maximum value that you can provide here is 2,562 days. It's a magic number. It's a little bit over 7 years. In most organizations, if you have to maintain your data content for so many years, we typically try to get rid of that content once we hit that threshold. At Kavrak Fitness, we don't have any requirements for this. At the bottom of the console, we have an option where you can specify that you want to purge exported archiving data only. This tells your Microsoft Lync Server to not delete any content unless it's been exported out of the system. And next we're going to commit our changes, and then close out of the control panel. Well, before we close out of the video, I just want to add a note in regards to setting up Microsoft Exchange integration for archiving storage. If you want to set up the integration between the two products, you have to do this primarily through your command line. Well, number one, you would configure your Lync Server 2013 server to be a partner application for Microsoft Exchange Server 2013. Microsoft provides a PowerShell script for you in the Exchange Scripts directory. The script is called configure-enterprise partner application.ps1. It's a PowerShell script. You would also have to configure your Exchange Server 2013 box to be a partner application for the Lync Server 2013 environment. You would define the open authorization configuration settings. There's a commandlet set-cs auth configuration, and you would also have to define your partner application through the command line using the new -cs partner application commandlet. So again, the key point here is that there's a lot involved with setting up the integration with Microsoft Exchange, and it's done primarily through command line. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and we'll see you in the next video.